Hi everyone, I'm Lauren of Virtuous Courtesan, and today I want to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects in the world, textiles. So often when we talk about garment construction, we're focused on what pattern did you use, or what seaming did you use, what were the finishing techniques that were on the garment, and we kind of tend to forget to talk about the actual materials that go into the garment and how they affect the final outcome. I understand this is a subject that is both intimidating and a little bit dry. So today, what I want to do is basically break down a textile into the two major components that affect its behavior, and then focus on one of those components so you can have a better understanding of how it affects the garment that you make. One thing you'll find that's adding to the confusion is how we talk about textiles. At one point, you didn't need to differentiate what the fiber was from what the composition, because there weren't as many options. For example, if you talked about satin, it had to mean silk satin. That was the only option. If it was cotton, it actually was called sateen. But today, we have a lot of different fiber options. So if you talk about satin, it could be a polyester satin, it could be an acetate satin, it could be a blend of a bunch of different things. And so it can be very confusing when trying to make something, knowing how to pick the right thing. So today I basically want to talk about just fiber content and how the fiber content affects the final garment. And then in our next YouTube, I'm going to talk about the construction and how the construction affects the final garment. So bear with me. I promise it'll be worth it, and it might be a little slow, but it's going to be worth it. I promise. So your fibers can essentially be broken down into three main categories. These are going to be your natural fibers, your man-made or your artificial fibers, and your synthetic fibers. And each of these fibers react a little bit differently. So what I want to do is go through each of them and give you some specifics on each. You don't have to remember all of this. I've made you a handy dandy little chart for you to look at, and I will post this as well on my Instagram. So this is the chart of all of the textile categories. There are, of course, more textiles than what I've listed, but I've just started with these so you can have a great understanding of the most common ones. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through this chart very briefly, and then I'm going to talk to you about each of the fibers and share with you some of their features and benefits so you have a better understanding of how they work. We start our chart with our natural fibers, and these are the fibers that come from the earth. So you would think of anything that is plant-based or anything that is animal-based. Cellulosic are your plant-based fibers. So those are your cottons, your linens, your hemps. And then our protein fibers are going to be our animal fibers. Those are going to be the silks and your wools. For our artificial fibers, these are what we think of as man-modified. These are initially earth fibers, but then they were modified chemically in a lab to create something new. And essentially this is rayon. Rayon is its own category. In Europe, viscose is what you call rayon. So you may see one or the other if you're shopping for fabrics or you're shopping for clothing. It's essentially the same thing. And then within rayon, you have some subdivisions of rayon, such as your modals and your lyocells, and those are just types of rayon. And last but not least, we have our synthetics, and these are the fibers that are created entirely in the lab. So these are going to be your polyesters, your nylons, acrylics, spandex, and acetates. And so these are entirely man-made, and they have their own features as well. So now I'm going to go through each of those and give you a little bit of information about what is unique about them and how it is affected by wearing. So we're going to start by talking about cotton, and of course you're familiar with cotton, but it may have some features and benefits that you're not. So cotton tends to have a very dry hand, and in the textile world, that is as opposed to slick or smooth or cool. So it tends to be quite dry, but it is very breathable and it's very soft. So despite the dry hand, it's very comfortable to wear. It makes beautiful garments. In addition to being dry, it actually absorbs a lot of moisture. And when it absorbs that moisture, it tends to hold on to it very closely. And so if you think of a cotton ball, we might use that to soak up moisture, or a paper towel. That makes sense. But it's something also to keep in mind if you're making a garment that might be close to the body or have to deal with perspiration, because while it will absorb the perspiration, it's also going to hold on to it, and it will stay wetter longer. There's no nice way to say that, I apologize. In addition, cotton does wrinkle pretty easily. but it is pretty amenable to high heat, so it irons easily too. It's able to take steam. It does shrink, so you may want to look for pre-shrunk cotton or pre-shrink your cotton. So just some of the things to keep in mind when working with it. In addition, when you're rating the quality of cotton, you're going to think of the staple of fiber. And so basically the longer the individual staple or the longer the individual pieces of the plant, the higher quality the cotton is. So often we'll think about like a Pima cotton sheet. And this is a long staple cotton fiber. And when you think of, if you've ever heard of Supima cotton, this is a branded version of that long staple cotton. So you're going to be able to get those thinner, finer strands with that longer staple. So something to keep in mind when considering your cottons. And next we get to linen. And linen is made from the flax plant. And while I won't get into the history of it, I think it's so neat that it actually predates cotton. So it's much older. I just think that's so cool. From an appearance perspective, it tends to have a slight sheen, and the fabric made of linen tends to have a cool hand. And so you can feel that when you touch it. It's an extremely durable fiber. It wrinkles very easily. It takes very high heat. If you ever notice on your iron, the highest setting on your iron will be for linen. That's because it can take that really, really high heat. But it's because of its durability, it washes incredibly well, and it tends to soften as you wash it, and that's part of the beauty of it. So you can get a washed linen, or you can take a linen and wash it, and it just softens up over time. Think about a really great well-loved linen sheet that will kind of have that same thing. One of the things that are so neat about linen is that it tends to have some of these properties that we think of as technological from our synthetics, and those two things are antimicrobial and wicking. Antimicrobial is the inhibition of bacteria, and so it tends to prevent bacteria from growing, which is great. And wicking is the movement of moisture. So if you perspire in linen, it will take the moisture from your skin, move it to the surface of the fabric, and help it dry. This is really, really important if you're in climates where you might perspire, or even in winter climates, because by keeping you dry, you're going to stay comfortable. But that antimicrobial inhibition will keep you comfortable, and that's part of why we see so much linen in historic dress, is because it was such a functional fiber, in addition to having a really great beauty to it. Hemp has a lot of the same characteristics as linen. It's extremely durable, very, very strong. It is abrasive resistant. It takes color well, although it does start as a darker natural color. But some of the downsides to it is that it doesn't really drape well, and it can be a little bit stiffer of a fabric. So if you see it in an apparel function, it's probably going to be on either a more utilitarian garment or blended with other fibers to help give it a little bit softness or drapeability. So next we're going to talk about our protein fibers, and specifically I'm going to talk about our silks and our wools. Silk is made from the cocoon of the silkworm, which has been unspooled. And what's so neat about this is that you can unspool the cocoon and you get one long fiber. You get this monofilament, and it's the only monofilament in the natural world. So while from a contemporary standpoint, it's hard to understand the importance of this because we have so many monofilaments in our synthetics and our artificials, from a historical perspective, this was pretty neat because you were able to get these incredibly smooth and lustrous textiles that you couldn't achieve with your cottons, your linens, and your wools. And that was part of the incredible appeal to this. In addition to the monofilament, silk is actually incredibly durable. We think of it as really, precious and frail, but it's actually incredibly strong. The caveat to this is it weakens pretty quickly when it's wet, as well as it degrades pretty quickly when it's faced with bleach or with perspiration. And so that's two things to keep in mind when working with silk. Obviously, it's incredibly lustrous. It has a really great natural sheen to it and a really beautiful hand to it. And it is just one of those fibers that just has a nice, luxurious feel, regardless of how it's woven or knit together. What else? Oh, I remember, it is actually a natural insulator. So when you think of silk underwear, it seems kind of like a strange thing to us, that they used to make these silk long underwear, but it actually has a natural insulation property, so it is quite good at keeping you warm. Who knew? So that's silk for you. So next I'm going to talk to you about wool. And when I'm talking about wool here, I'm talking specifically about sheep wool, and not other animal hair fibers such as cashmere or Angora. Wool is, of course, our winter fiber. We think of this as our natural insulator. What it does is it essentially traps air pockets, and that helps to keep you warm. But in addition, what makes it so great for clothing is that it is antimicrobial and it has wicking. So much like linen does, so does wool. It tends to resist wrinkling, which is wonderful, but it also can mean that it can tend to resist pleating or pressing. So you really have to, work with it to try to get it to have that permanent pleat if you're trying to maneuver it in that way. It's extremely durable, and it's actually naturally flame resistant, which I know some of my reenactors who work with campfires already know. So it will self-extinguish, and it's flame resistant. So if you light it on fire for a burn test, or if you're wearing a long skirt and you're around a campfire, it is a much better option sometimes than some of the other fibers that will go up much quicker in flames. So next we're going to talk about our artificials, or our man-modifieds. And in this case specifically, I'm going to talk about rayon. Rayon is made from wood pulp. So essentially my understanding of it is they take the wood pulp, they put it through a spinneret, and it creates the fiber. I always like to imagine it like a giant cotton candy machine. I don't know if it actually looks like that, but that's kind of where my head goes when I envision it. Because of its source material, the wood pulp, it has a lot of the similar properties to cotton, such as it's breathable, it's absorbent, it burns a lot like cotton. It's kind of hard to differentiate cotton and rayon in a burn test because it burns like paper. But it's sold as a synthetic silk because it can have a really cool, soft hand. You can get incredible drape out of it. Often you'll see cottons and rayons blended together because you're able to get the drape of the rayon and then the hand of the naturalness of the cotton. So it's a really interesting fiber. Some of the drawbacks to rayon, though, is that it can be weaker when wet. It can yellow over time. I know it can shrink. Anyone who's ever bought a vintage dress from the 30s has cried miserably if they've tried to wash it as it shrunk to a mini dress, and then you have to painstakingly steam it out, which it can be weaker and it can destroy the fabric. And the dye process can be really toxic, so there definitely are limitations with the fiber, but otherwise it's a unique position between the naturals and between the synthetics, and you see a lot of it on the market, especially in commercial clothing. So something to look for, you'll see a lot when you're making clothing. If you're making reproduction clothing from the 40s or 50s, you'll use a lot of rayon because they had a lot of rayon then. So interesting fiber, and one definitely that to be aware of. And next we're going to talk about the synthetics. And while synthetics were not a part of historic dress until their individual inventions, what I want to do is share some of the features and benefits so that you might make a better educated decision when trying to decide if and when you want to substitute a synthetic for a natural fiber in building a garment. The first one I want to talk about is polyester, as it's likely the most common synthetic on the market. Polyester is made from petrochemicals. It's an oil-based fiber, and because of its base, it does retain a lot of the properties of oil, such as it tends to be hydrophobic. It's a little bit scared of water. It's not absorbent of water at all. It tends to resist wrinkling. It has a low melting point. It can have wicking or antimicrobial, but in terms of polyester, generally speaking, these are going to be topical finishes. that are added to the garment. You can think of this when you think about some of your workout gear might advertise that it has wicking or quick dry. And those are all going to be finishes that are put on top of it. It's very durable to the point that it's not biodegradable, and it takes color extremely well because it's polyester. They can put it at the liquid level when they're making it. So polyester is interesting. You're going to see a lot of polyester, and sometimes if you're shopping for natural fibers, it can be difficult to try to avoid it, but you may find that there's a place for it in your work while working. A little bit about nylon. Nylon is also a petrochemical. It's extremely durable, actually more tensile strength than polyester, which is interesting. It can be affected by moisture. It takes color well, but the colors can fade in time. If you've ever seen a mid-century slip, it tends to have this slick, cool hand, but sometimes the color has kind of migrated on it. And what's interesting is it also can be very low pilling. So that's nylon for you. Acrylic, which is also a petrochemical, is the synthetic wool of this category. It tends to be extremely warming. It's a bulky fiber and it has low wrinkling. It's not something that you'll often see in historical dress unless you're looking for an alternate to wool. It is low allergy and non-biodegradable. Just a really brief touch on spandex. Spandex is a polyurethane polystyrene. It of course is added for stretch. So you might have a fabric that has natural mechanical stretch, but by adding spandex, when the fabric is created, you're able to get a lot more stretch to it. You're going to see it in your swimwear. You're going to see it in all of your contemporary athletic wear. It doesn't biodegrade, but it does wear out over time. So eventually you'll stretch it out and it won't go back in. And that's when the spandex has kind of given up on you. It's not something commonly seen in historic costuming because it's not something that was part of history, but it can be something that you might want to know whether or not to avoid it while you're working. And last but not least, we have acetate. Now, acetate's source material is wood pulp, so therefore I could have easily put it in the artificial category. I've put it in the synthetics because it melts instead of burns and because it is dissolvable. It could be in either. What you should know about acetate is you're most likely to see it as such in like a synthetic taffeta, acetate taffeta. It tends to have a crisp, cool hand. It takes color well, but the color can fade. It's not washable and it tends to have a low pill. It's an extremely toxic manufacturing process to make it. So that's something to keep in mind. And when I talk about dissolve, it actually dissolves in acetone, nail polish remover. Whew. That was a lot, right guys? It was a lot for me too. I hope you join me next time when we talk about construction and how it affects textiles. And until then, if you have any questions, please write below. And I hope you'll follow me here on YouTube or on Instagram at Virtuous Courtesan. Happy sewing!